You ever walked into a room where everyone hoped you'd never show up, only to flip the entire game in one sentence? I did. After years of silence, I came back home expecting nothing, and left the room with everything they thought they'd buried. What happened in that meeting shook the walls of a family built on secrets and control. You're not gonna believe how deep the betrayal ran, or how perfectly the tables turned. Let me take you back to where it all started. The day I found out my father was gone, I was finalizing a green infrastructure project in Portland. My name's Emily Walker, 32, born and raised in Ashridge, Oregon, a quiet town where family names matter more than titles. I hadn't spoken to my stepmother, Valerie, in nearly 6 years. Not since she shut the door, literally and figuratively, on everything I had left of my dad. I got the news through a voicemail. From a neighbor. Not family. It hit hard, not just because he was gone, but because I wasn't even considered worth a direct call. Valerie had always treated me like I didn't belong, and now, even in grief, I was reminded of my exile. I was angry. But underneath that? I was heartbroken. I wasn't just mourning his death, I was mourning the years we lost. I booked the flight home that night. Not because I was welcome, but because something deep inside me said I had to go. You don't just disappear when your father dies. Especially when you carry his name, his instincts, and, unbeknownst to them, his plan. They thought they buried more than a man that week. But my dad? He knew them. And he knew me. What they didn't know was that he left behind more than memories. He left behind me, the daughter they tried to erase, coming back with the truth in hand. There's something about that old oak tree in our backyard. It's still there, towering over the faded grass like a silent witness to everything we used to be. When I was 10, Dad and I built a little reading bench under it from leftover wood scraps. We called it our thinking spot. I'd sit there after school with my sketchpad while he read zoning codes and property plans. That tree was the heartbeat of my childhood. So when I stood before it again after all those years, suitcase in hand, it almost hurt to look at. The swing was gone. The bench was rotten through. And Valerie's perfectly trimmed garden had swallowed half the trunk. Like she wanted to suffocate the past. Or maybe just me. But grief has a funny way of bringing memories back in full color. I could almost hear my dad laughing, telling me that some roots run too deep to pull out. And in that moment, I realized, I hadn't come back for revenge. I came back to remember who I was before they rewrote my story. That oak tree didn't forget me. And neither did this town. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own family story, I feel you. This journey? It's not just about wills and property. It's about identity, memory, and standing your ground when no one else will. So if real-life stories of resilience, family tension, and unexpected redemption mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe. I've got so much more to share. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Who knows? Maybe your story isn't so different from mine. When I stepped inside the house, it didn't feel like home, it felt like a showroom. Cold surfaces. Modern lines. Nothing of the cozy, cluttered warmth my dad once loved. Gone were the creaky floors and messy book stacks. In their place? Silence. The kind that stings more than words ever could. Valerie stood in the hallway, dressed like grief was a performance. She looked surprised to see me. Not shocked I was grieving, but shocked I had the nerve to show up. "Oh, Emily," she said, like I was a memory she hoped never returned. I nodded, brushing past her, feeling every ounce of distance she'd carefully built over the years. There was no hug. No, I'm sorry. Just cold eyes, tracking my every move like I was a threat. Maybe I was. After all, I was the only one who remembered the version of my father that existed before she took over the narrative. And that's the thing with people like Valerie. They forget that legacies don't just vanish, they wait. Quietly. Patiently. Until someone brave enough steps up to claim them. The guest room smelled like lavender and bleach, clinical, unfamiliar. It was the only space Valerie would allow me to sleep in, even though my old room was still down the hall. That room had been mine since I was 5. Now it was full of boxes labeled seasonal decor and Valerie's linens. Like even my childhood had been evicted. I sat on the edge of the bed, numb. Every surface in that house had been wiped clean of my father's presence. No framed photos. No old business journals. Not even his mug, the one that said world's okayest golfer. Valerie had swept it all away like he was an inconvenience now gone. But I knew better. Dad wasn't the type to leave loose ends. Especially not with people like her. My phone buzzed. It was Callie, our old neighbor and my childhood best friend. "Emily," she said, her voice low. "There's something I think you should know. Your dad, he left you something. And I don't think Valerie knows about it." The weight of those words settled on my chest like concrete. I didn't know what it was, or why he kept it secret. But I did know this: my father wouldn't have gone through the trouble of hiding something unless it mattered. A whisper of possibility stirred something fierce in me, something that hadn't stirred in years. Hope. When I was 16, Dad and I stood in the middle of a construction site, our first project together. It was a tiny duplex in East Ashridge, but to me it felt like the Empire State Building. I remember him handing me the blueprint with a smirk. "This is more than wood and nails, Em. It's a promise to someone who hasn't been born yet." That stuck with me. He always talked about legacy like it was sacred. Not just buildings, but what they stood for. Community. Accessibility. Integrity. He didn't care about flashy developments or making the cover of real estate magazines. He cared about doing things right, even when it took longer. Even when no one noticed. It was that memory that made Callie's message hit different. My dad had hidden something, but not out of fear. Out of strategy. He knew the people around him couldn't be trusted, so he went underground, quiet and precise. It was classic him, never confrontational, but never careless. Suddenly, it wasn't just about my grief. It was about that promise, the one we made under dusty scaffolding and late afternoon sun. I couldn't let Valerie erase that. I wouldn't. Legacy wasn't just a memory. It was a mission. The next morning, I left the house early before anyone was awake, or pretending to be. I walked the familiar streets of Ashridge, past the old firehouse, the bakery where Dad used to order one cinnamon roll and one for whoever's brave enough to dream big. It was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I kept thinking about what Callie had said. Something left behind. Back home, I made my way to the study, what used to be Dad's office. Valerie had gutted it, of course. Gone were the maps, the framed deeds, the corkboard with plans. But one thing still hung there, a painting of the Three Sisters Mountains. It was his favorite. Always said it reminded him that nature doesn't rush, but it never stops, either. I stepped closer, remembering his exact words. "If anything ever happens, don't let the mountains fool you. There's always more beneath the surface." My heart pounded. I turned the frame over and ran my fingers along the back. Taped behind the canvas was a small key, worn and silver. That was the moment I knew, Dad had left a trail. And I had just found the first clue. Before everything got twisted, I was just a girl who loved blueprints more than Barbies. My name is Emily Walker, and growing up in Ashridge, Oregon, I wasn't exactly your typical small-town daughter. While other kids chased fireflies, I chased floor plans. My dad used to bring me to job sites like most parents bring kids to baseball games. It wasn't just bonding, it was purpose. A shared rhythm between us that made the world make sense. I thought we were unshakable. I thought that bond was forever. We lost my mom when I was 8. That was the first fracture. But instead of breaking us, it made us closer. My dad and I turned grief into grit, poured our sadness into sketches and Saturday home projects. He'd read me zoning laws as bedtime stories, and I loved every second of it. The house was quiet, yes, but it was filled with a different kind of love, one that came from shared goals and mutual respect. He didn't treat me like a child. He treated me like a partner. And I stepped into that role with everything I had. From middle school on, I was his sidekick. My weekends were filled with site inspections and budget spreadsheets. I wore construction boots to junior prom setup. I knew it wasn't normal, but I didn't want normal, I wanted to build something real. I thought we had a future mapped out, brick by brick. Until someone else came in and rewrote the blueprint. She didn't knock. She moved in like she already owned the place. And just like that, the rhythm changed. Valerie showed up in our lives like a glossy magazine cover. Too perfect. Too polished. The kind of woman who smiled with her teeth, not her eyes. I was 15, old enough to spot a performance. At first, I gave her a chance, because Dad did. He deserved happiness. After years of carrying the weight alone, he looked lighter with her around. He laughed more. Cooked less. I told myself that was okay. But the change didn't stop at his habits. The house started shifting. Little things disappeared. Family photos replaced by abstract art. The kitchen pantry reorganized with labels and silence. Then bigger things vanished, like our Sunday morning breakfast tradition and the way Dad used to invite me to meetings. Valerie didn't just enter our lives. She took over. And I felt myself shrinking. My seat at the dinner table moved, literally. Dad started taking her to events I used to attend. When I mentioned it, he brushed it off. "You're busy with school." But I wasn't. I was just sidelined. She was charming to everyone else. But behind closed doors, her eyes were measuring me. Calculating. Like she was deciding just how much space I took up in her new kingdom. And the answer was clear, too much. So she started making room the only way she knew how, by pushing me out. Look, if you've ever felt like you were slowly being written out of your own family. I see you. This story? It's not just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever had to fight for their place when someone else decided you didn't belong. And sometimes, the quietest erasure is the one that hurts the most. If this part of the story is landing deep for you, give it a like, it helps more people find these stories, and honestly, It means the world. And if you're someone who believes in keeping truth alive, consider clicking that "thanks" button down below. It's the little heart with a dollar sign. Every super thanks helps this channel stay afloat and keeps these voices heard. Now, let's talk about the night it all came crashing down. It was supposed to be a normal dinner. I remember the smell of rosemary chicken and tension. Dad had just finished telling us about a new housing development proposal, something meant to give families a fair shot at living in town without selling their souls. He looked at me and asked, "What do you think, Em?" I lit up. I pulled out my sketchpad and started explaining my ideas for mixed-income units, energy-efficient layouts, shared green spaces. He was nodding, engaged, until she cut in. Valerie laughed softly, sipping her wine. "That's adorable, Emily," she said, like I was reciting a poem from kindergarten. "But Richard and I already decided, this project needs a luxury angle. Think exclusivity. Prestige." I went cold. "We? What happened to he?" I looked at Dad. He didn't correct her. He didn't say a word. That silence broke me. I pushed back. Told him this wasn't who he was. That he taught me better than this. That our work was about people, not profit. He said I was being immature. That I didn't understand business. I said she was manipulating him. He told me I needed to grow up. And when I asked if he was choosing her over me, he didn't deny it. "Maybe it's time you figured things out on your own," he said. So I did. I packed my bags. And I left the home we built together, alone. When I left Ashridge, I didn't just leave a town, I left a version de mim que neokabia mazali. I landed in Seattle with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and the kind of heartbreak that doesn't show up in photos. For a while, I slept on a friend's couch and took freelance drafting jobs to stay afloat. It wasn't glamorous. But every blueprint I sketched, every sidewalk cafe I passed, reminded me I was doing it. On my own. Without anyone's permission. And honestly? That became my fuel. I threw myself into urban design with a fire I didn't know I had. I stopped looking back. My name started showing up in design journals. My proposals were getting city attention, small projects at first, then bigger. Greener. Smarter. More human. Every time someone praised my vision, I smiled and thought, Dad would have been proud, if he could see it without her in his ear. But even as I moved forward, something stayed unresolved. You can succeed across the country, win awards, build your own empire, and still carry a silent ache. Because success doesn't erase being disowned. It doesn't fix the version of yourself that was left standing in a driveway, suitcase in hand, wondering if you were really that easy to let go. I told myself I'd never go back. Not unless it was on my terms. Turns out, fate had its own plans. It was a rainy Thursday morning when my phone rang. I was reviewing site plans for a community garden project when I saw the name, Callie Nichols. I hadn't heard from her in years. She stayed in Ashridge, running the local flower shop her mom used to own. She Saij. Voice thin, I didn't know who else to call. "I thought you should hear it from someone who actually cares." I froze before she even said the words. "Your dad passed last night." Just like that. No build-up. No preamble. And suddenly, I was back in that house, in that fight, in that moment when he said maybe it was time I left. The grief hit me sideways, not just for the man who was gone, but for the years we'd never get back. For the phone calls I never made. For the silence I thought he chose. I said nothing for a long time. Just sat there, eyes burning. "He asked about you," Callie added quietly. "A lot. Especially near the end. Valerie never told you, did she?" "Of course not. That woman guarded access to him like a hawk. She made sure the door I left stayed locked. But even through all that, he remembered me. He wanted to reach out. And now, he couldn't. That was all I needed. I booked my flight home that night. Ashridge hadn't changed much. But the house had. It used to smell like cedar and old books. Now it smelled like antiseptic and artificial vanilla. The walls were repainted. The family photos were gone. In their place, abstract canvases and vases that looked too fragile to touch. The home I grew up in had been sterilized into a showroom. But the worst part wasn't what had changed. It was how obvious it was that I no longer belonged. Valerie opened the door wearing black silk and a smile that didn't dare reach her eyes. "Emily," she said, like she'd tasted something sour. "We didn't expect you." Her tone said it all. "You're late. You're not wanted. You're inconvenient." I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded. "I came for my father." She didn't offer condolences. She offered distance. "You can stay in the guest room," she said, already turning away. "Your old room's full of storage now." As if the room where I made pillow forts and college applications had been reduced to boxes of outdated holiday decor. I wanted to argue. But grief and jet lag tangled up my voice. So I carried my suitcase in silence. But I was already planning my next move. I tried not to take it personally, the way Valerie acted like I was just a guest in a boutique hotel. But it was impossible not to notice the deliberate omissions. No trace of me remained in that house, not a childhood photo, not a school trophy, not even the little porcelain fox I used to keep by my windowsill. It was like I had been erased with surgical precision. The house looked more like a catalog spread than a place that once held a father and daughter rebuilding life together. But this wasn't forgetfulness. It was strategy. At breakfast the next morning, Valerie spoke in clipped sentences. No mention of the funeral arrangements. No details. When I asked, she smiled and said, "We've already taken care of it." We. Her and her children. Not me. The way she said it made it sound like they were the family. And I was just the estranged relic they couldn't stop from showing up. I sat across the table, biting the inside of my cheek, trying to keep my grief from becoming rage. Then came the real sting. "We'll be meeting with the attorney tomorrow," she said, buttering toast like we were talking about weather. "Just a small family consultation regarding the estate. You understand?" I blinked, confused. "I am family." She looked up, eyes cool and flat. "Of course, dear. But things are delicate." And there it was. The exclusion. Veiled, polite, unmistakable. My own father's will. And I wasn't invited to hear it. They really thought they had shut me out for good. That afternoon, I took a walk to clear my head, but Ashridge's familiar streets only deepened the ache. The bakery still had the same chipped sign. The bookstore still displayed classics in the window. Life had continued without me, untouched by my silence. But the town whispered, the way small towns do. People stared longer than usual, their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't: "She's back. She came home after all this time." I wondered how many of them knew the real reason I left. I stopped by Callie's flower shop. She looked up from arranging a bouquet and immediately put down her scissors. "You okay?" she asked, even though we both knew the answer. "Not really," I said, managing a weak laugh. She pulled me into the back room, away from the customers and the stares. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," she said, her voice dropping. "Your dad came into the shop a few weeks before he passed. He left something with me." My heart did a slow, cautious flip. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small envelope, aged at the corners, my name written on the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "He said you'd know what to do with it." My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a short note. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance to explain. But I had to protect what mattered. There's more, look under the painting in the study. Love, Dad." I stared at the paper like it might vanish if I blinked. Callie placed a hand on my shoulder. "I think he never stopped trying. Eminencia. I think he found his own way to reach you." And I knew then, something was waiting for me. Something only I was meant to find. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of the guest room, trying to understand how grief could feel so much like fury. I was angry at Valerie for cutting me out. Angry at myself for staying away. Angry that the last words I said to my father weren't kind, and that I never called back, never sent that letter I kept rewriting in my mind but never mailed. The guilt curled around me like a second blanket I couldn't shake off. But guilt wasn't all I felt. Because under the guilt, there was something else: resolve. My father hadn't just reached out. He'd planned. He'd hidden something. And that meant he knew. He knew he was being manipulated. He knew what she was doing. And instead of letting her win, he left me a trail. He trusted me to follow it. That meant something. It meant everything. I got up around 3 a.m., barefoot and restless. The house was still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like a ghost in your own memories. I crept down the hallway, heart pounding, and slipped into the study. It had been completely remodeled, of course, chrome desk, sterile lighting, soulless art. But the one thing Valerie hadn't touched was the painting of the Three Sisters Mountains. It had always been his favorite. I turned it over and found the tape. Behind the frame, tucked neatly where only he would think to hide it, was a small metal key. Cold. Heavy. Real. I clutched it in my hand like it was a lifeline. Because maybe, it was. The next morning, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, clutching the key like it might whisper answers if I held it tight enough. Ashridge was slowly waking up, birds chirping, a jogger passing by, but the world inside me was still spinning. That's when I saw Callie coming up the driveway with a paper bag and 2 coffees. She didn't ask if she could sit. She just did, like always. Some friendships don't need permission. "I figured you didn't sleep," she said, handing me the coffee. I shook my head and let out a breath that felt like it had been stuck in my chest since I got off the plane. "He left me something," I whispered, showing her the key. Her eyes widened, but she didn't ask questions. She just nodded, like she'd known all along that there was more to this story. "You gonna find out what it opens?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Today." We sat there in silence for a while, sipping our drinks. The kind of silence that feels like safety, not awkwardness. I didn't realize how much I'd missed it, being around someone who knew who I was before. Someone who didn't see me as a threat or a liability, just Emily. And in that moment, I felt a sliver of something I hadn't felt since before Dad died. Support. I wasn't doing this alone anymore. I waited until the house was empty. Valerie and her kids had gone to town for a funeral errand, and I knew this was my window. The key felt heavier now, like it knew how much power it held. I slipped into the study again and scanned every corner until I remembered something: Dad's old safety deposit box. He used to mention it like it was just for boring paperwork, but I always suspected otherwise. There was no mention of it in any of the documents Valerie showed me. I grabbed the old banker's box I found in the hall closet and dug through receipts and folders until I found it: First Ashridge Bank. Box number 312. My breath caught. It was real. This wasn't just some sentimental key. It opened something tangible, something hidden from everyone but me. I drove straight to the bank, heart thudding like a war drum. The clerk hesitated, asking for ID. But when I signed my name and slid the key across the counter, she gave a little nod. Right this way. The metal door opened with a loud clunk, and inside the private room, she left me alone. The box was plain, but what it held wasn't. Inside was a manila folder and a black USB drive. That was it. But somehow, it felt like the whole world had shifted. I sat there staring at them, pulse hammering in my ears. This was my father's voice reaching me across time. I didn't wait. I went straight to Callie's shop. She had an old laptop in the back she used for invoices. She locked the front door and closed the blinds while I plugged in the drive with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The screen blinked to life, and there he was. My father. Not in a photo. Not in a memory. But alive, speaking directly to me. My breath caught. I hadn't realized how much I missed his voice until it filled the room again. Emily, he said, his voice calm but tired. If you're watching this, then you found what I hoped you would. He smiled slightly, eyes soft. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. I was trying to protect you. From Valerie. From what she's become. But I knew you'd come back someday. And I needed you to know, you were never the one who left. You were pushed away. And I'm sorry I didn't stop it. The tears came before I could stop them. Silent, hot, endless. He kept talking. Explaining how over the past year, he quietly began transferring assets, properties, shares, development rights, out of Valerie's reach and into a trust under my name. Legal. Discreet. Protected. This company was always meant to be yours, he said. You saw people, not just profits. You carried your mother's vision and mine. That's the future this town needs. And then, his final words: finish what we started. I sat there, the laptop humming softly, my hands over my mouth. Everything I thought I lost had never truly been taken. The manila folder that came with the USB felt thin, barely a dozen pages, but every sheet inside it carried weight. Deeds, notarized transfers, corporate filings, all bearing my name. I recognized some of the properties right away: Main Street commercial units, the old lumber yard by the river, and the undeveloped lot near Ridgeview Elementary. These weren't just assets. They were my father's plan for the future of Ashridge. He hadn't left me scraps. He'd left me the foundation. And Valerie didn't have a clue. Each document was dated, signed, sealed, legally binding. My father had quietly built a second business entity, Walker Land and Community Trust, and over the course of a year, transferred the most valuable assets into it. Some through gifts, others through private sales at symbolic prices. And every transaction had been registered. This wasn't an emotional gesture, it was a calculated move. He had prepared for a war he wouldn't live to fight. And he chose me to win it. I stared at the line on one deed that read owner, Emily R. Walker, and felt something deep shift inside me. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was responsible. For land. For people. For everything he spent his life building. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. And I was ready. The next morning, I drove to Franklin Ross's office. He was my dad's old business attorney. A man with white hair, a dry wit, and a poker face that never cracked. When he opened the door and saw me holding that folder, something changed in his eyes. Well, he said, stepping aside, I was wondering when you'd show up. No surprise. No denial. Just calm recognition that something long in motion had finally reached its turning point. I found everything, I said, handing over the folder. He flipped through the documents like he already knew what they were. Your dad trusted you, he muttered. Trusted that you'd come back when it counted. I asked him if Valerie knew. He chuckled, dry and short. Not a clue. She's been busy decorating her future with assets that no longer belong to her. He leaned forward. You're in control now, Emily. These properties are yours. This town could be yours, if you want it. Want it? I'd never been more sure of anything. He pulled out a second folder with additional paperwork, operating agreements, business licenses, tax ID filings. Everything Dad had built had been duplicated under the new trust, insulated from Valerie's grasp. Franklin had overseen the whole process. My father had been fighting for me the entire time. He just couldn't say it out loud. I left Franklin's office with my head spinning and my heart pounding. The sun was bright, but everything looked sharper, like I was seeing the town for the first time. The diner where Dad used to take me after site inspections. The community park we helped fund. The little bench by the river where I first told him I wanted to study architecture. These weren't just memories. They were markers of the legacy I had just inherited. And for the first time in years, I felt grounded. But under that steadying sense of purpose, there was a storm. I missed him more than I could put into words. I wanted to call him, tell him I found the key, the box, the folder. I wanted to ask how he pulled it all off under Valerie's nose. I wanted to hear him say, "I knew you'd find it." But he was gone. And all I had was a screen, a signature, and a silent promise to protect what he left behind. I sat in my car for nearly an hour. Crying, breathing, remembering. Then, when I was done, I did what he would have done. I made a plan. I gathered all the deeds, made backup copies of the video, and reviewed the corporate structure until I could explain it in my sleep. This wasn't going to be emotional. It was going to be strategic. Because if Valerie thought I was just back to mourn, she was about to learn who my father really raised. And I wasn't backing down. Before heading back to the house, I stopped at the edge of the Ridgeview lot, an empty stretch of land my dad always said held more potential than people realized. When I was 17, we used to walk its boundary lines while he spoke about building something that served everyone, not just those who could afford it. Standing there now, knowing he had placed this land in my hands, felt like a second heartbeat waking up in my chest. He had passed me the torch quietly, confidently, without spectacle. That's how he always did his best work, understated but unstoppable. I called Callie and asked her to meet me there. When she arrived, she didn't say a word, just looked at the deeds I showed her and whispered, "Oh my God." I nodded, unable to speak at first. She was the first person I shared the full truth with. The videos, the trust, the quiet plan my father had executed while the rest of the family schemed for control. And as I spoke, the fear began to dissolve. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was stepping forward. "You know they're going to lose their minds, right?" she said. "I'm counting on it," I replied. Not to be petty, not to prove a point, but to correct one. To reclaim the truth that had been buried under luxury finishes and cold silence. I wasn't an outsider. I wasn't a guest. I was my father's daughter, in name, in spirit, in legacy. And I was done being quiet about it. My next move would say everything. Back at the house, I found the family gathered in the living room. Valerie sat like she belonged on a throne, sipping wine and reviewing paperwork on her tablet, while her son Connor sprawled across the couch, oblivious, tapping away on his phone. No one looked up when I entered. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting their ignorance soak in. They had no idea what was coming. No clue that the properties they planned to sell were already legally mine. They thought they were in control. That was about to change. Valerie finally glanced up. "We'll be heading to Harold's office tomorrow," she said with an air of forced sympathy. "Of course, it's just a formal thing for family members." She said it with such practiced cruelty it almost made me laugh. "Right," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'll be there." Her eyebrow twitched. "Well, we assumed, considering the estrangement," I cut her off. I said, "I'll be there." The silence that followed was heavy. Connor looked up, confused. Valerie's eyes narrowed just slightly. She knew me well enough to sense something had shifted. But not well enough to understand what I was holding. I walked past them, calm and steady, the folder of deeds in my bag like an iron shield on my back. Let them enjoy the last hours of their illusion. Tomorrow, reality would hit the table like thunder. That night, I laid out every document, every transfer, every file my father left behind on the desk in my room. It looked like a legal battlefield: signatures, stamps, property IDs, maps. I made sure everything was perfectly organized. I printed multiple copies, labeled every folder. I was my father's daughter, after all. He taught me that presentation mattered just as much as truth. If I was going to walk into that room tomorrow, I would walk in prepared, poised, and unshakable. This was more than a meeting. It was a reckoning. And not just for Valerie. For me too. This was the moment I stopped being the exiled daughter and reclaimed the voice they tried to suppress. I practiced what I would say, over and over in my head, until it no longer sounded like revenge and started sounding like resolution. I didn't want to fight. I wanted clarity. I wanted what was mine, nothing more, nothing less. Around midnight, I rewatched my dad's video. This time, I didn't cry. I listened with a sense of steadiness I hadn't felt in years. "You always had the strength," he said in one clip, "you just had to be pushed far enough to find it." I whispered back to the screen, "I found it, Dad." Then I closed the laptop, packed the folder into my bag, and went to sleep for the first time in days. Tomorrow, the truth would speak for itself. Harold Stevenson's office sits on the third floor of Ashridge's only glass and steel building, a statement piece Valerie loves to call progress. I arrived 10 minutes early, folder tucked beneath my arm, heart drumming a steady cadence that felt more like purpose than fear. The receptionist's eyes widened when she read my name. Maybe she'd already heard the rumors rippling through town. She offered coffee, but water felt safer. I needed clarity, not caffeine jitters. The waiting room hummed with faint elevator jazz, and every tick of the wall clock sounded like a countdown. Valerie swept in right on time, designer heels clicking like gavel strikes, Connor slouching behind her, headphones dangling. She gave me a thin smile, polite veneer over iced steel annoyance, and took the seat farthest from mine, as if distance could dilute my presence. My fingers rested on the clasp of the folder, feeling the edges of each document like armor plating. Harold emerged, gray suit pressed, eyes flicking from Valerie to me with the wary look of a referee who knows the game just shifted. "Ms. Walker," he said, voice rehearsed, "Mr. Stevenson will see you now." Valerie rose first. Expecting deference, I matched her stride, refusing to trail behind. We entered the wood-paneled conference room where a single long table waited, polished, expectant, innocent. Innocent, at least, until the papers met its surface. A chandelier glittered above, reflecting on the glossy table like fractured stars. Harold cleared his throat, shuffling folders labeled Estate Matters and Property Holdings. Valerie's posture screamed confidence. Connor scrolled his phone, oblivious to nuance, while I slid into the chair opposite them. I set my own folder on the table, deliberate, audible. The sound landed like a forewarning thunderclap. Everyone went still. Harold began the formalities, reading the preamble to my father's last updated will. My pulse slowed, each syllable felt ordained. He spoke of household belongings, modest cash sums, sentimental heirlooms. Valerie relaxed, believing the script she'd written would play unchallenged. I waited, letting her comfort peak, because it would make the fall feel that much sharper when truth cut through. The moment came when Harold's voice wavered. "As for the properties held under Walker Land and Community Trust," Valerie's head snapped up, confusion slicing through her practiced serenity. Harold blinked, coughed, then continued, "They are hereby vested in full to Emily R. Walker." The words hovered, electric. Connor looked up, earbuds forgotten. I could hear my own breathing, and Valerie's, ragged beneath her composure. She leaned forward, knuckles widening. "That trust doesn't exist," she hissed. Audience forgotten. I didn't speak yet. I opened my folder with measured calm, sliding the first deed across the table, Main Street commercial block, stamped and signed. Then the second, Ridgeview lot. Then the third, riverfront parcel. One by one, a quiet symphony of paper hitting wood. I positioned them like chess pieces, check, check, check. Harold's eyes widened with every page. He recognized the county seals, the legal endorsements, the irrefutable timestamps. Connor muttered, "Mom," but she ignored him, her focus narrowing to the documents undermining her kingdom. "These are forged," she declared, voice brittle. "Richard was ill, he would never." I finally spoke, each word steady. "He did, and he was of sound mind. All filings are on record at the county courthouse. Feel free to verify." I slid a copy of the trust's incorporation papers across. "Your attorney can review those." Harold accepted them. Scanning. Silence thickened, broken only by pages turning and Valerie's uneven breathing. My heartbeat slowed, grounded by the knowledge that truth required no theatrics, just daylight. I could almost feel Dad's hand on my shoulder, steadying me, reminding me that facts shine brightest when everything else is shadow. Valerie's poise cracked, her voice rose an octave. "This is absurd, we were married. I handled all his business." I met her gaze, not angry anymore, just resolute. "And while you handled appearances, he protected substance. He trusted me to carry on what mattered." The chandelier's reflection scattered across the table, fragments of light dancing over deeds that sealed her defeat. Harold cleared his throat again, the referee forced to call the match. "These documents," he said carefully, "are authentic. The trust predates the final version of the will. Ms. Walker is, in fact, legal owner of the properties in question." His voice carried a reluctant respect, like he'd underestimated me and now saw the strategist behind the grief. Valerie slumped back, world tilting beneath her polished heels. Connor swore under his breath, the weight of consequence finally settling. I gathered the deeds, stacking them neatly. Not gloating, just finishing what my father started. "There's more," I said, producing a final sheet, a resolution naming me managing director of Walker Land and Community Trust. I placed it atop the pile, a quiet crown. Effective immediately, all operational decisions run through me. The assertion wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Authority isn't volume. It's certainty anchored in legitimacy. Valerie's mascaraed eyes flashed. You can't expect us to accept this. I kept my tone soft. You don't have to accept it. You just have to acknowledge reality. Harold nodded, confirming. This wasn't personal victory, it was a pivot point for everything Dad believed in: mixed-income housing, community gardens, sustainable spaces. I felt their future roots pressing inside my chest, ready to break ground. I stood, sliding the folder back into my bag. I'll be in touch regarding transitional matters, I said, professional yet unyielding. Connor opened his mouth to protest, but Valerie gripped his arm, finally sensing there was no loophole left to wriggle through. Grief flickered across her face, perhaps for the empire she thought she controlled, or for the realization that manipulation has an expiration date. Walking out, I didn't look back. Harold's office door clicked shut behind me like the final paragraph of a chapter long overdue. Outside, the late morning sun hit my face, and the weight I'd carried since I boarded the flight began to lift. My father's voice echoed in memory, "Finish what we started." I exhaled, steady and sure, stepping onto the path he paved, ready to build, ready to heal, ready to lead. By the time I stepped out onto Main Street, the rumors were already moving faster than the wind. Small towns don't keep secrets, they circulate them, polish them, and pass them like heirlooms. Callie met me at the cafe down the block, holding 2 coffees and a wary look. "You did it," she said, sliding one across the table. "They're already spinning the story. Valerie's saying your dad was confused, that she was misled." I exhaled through my nose, not surprised. They always twist the truth when it doesn't serve them anymore. "She can try," I said, unbothered. "The documents speak louder than any gossip." Still, I couldn't ignore the pit forming in my stomach. Valerie wasn't someone who took humiliation quietly. She'd built her identity on social clout, country club dinners, and that image of perfect composure. Watching it unravel in front of witnesses? That would burn her worse than any legal loss. "She'll come for you," Callie warned. "In court, in whispers, in whatever way she can." I nodded. I was already preparing. I didn't want a war, but I wasn't afraid of one either. "She can throw smoke," I said. "But I'm holding the fire." I spent the rest of the afternoon meeting with Franklin, finalizing statements, documenting every transfer, preparing for legal preemptives. We filed restraining orders on the properties to prevent unauthorized sales or alterations. I looped in a new financial advisor, connected with county regulators, and scheduled meetings with key tenants in the downtown block. The goal wasn't destruction. It was restoration and protection. 3 days later, I got the email. A formal invitation from Valerie's attorney, requesting a private discussion about an alternative resolution. I forwarded it to Franklin, who simply wrote back, "She's panicking. Take the meeting, but take control." So I agreed. Not because I owed her anything, but because closure only comes when the last illusion collapses. We met at her attorney's office, sleek, impersonal, the kind of space where truth wears a suit and a forced smile. Valerie looked tired, but her posture still screamed performance. "I don't want this to get ugly," she said. "Neither would your father." I let the silence hang between us like a mirror. "You mean the father who spent a year moving assets into my name because he didn't trust you?" Her lips tightened. Her attorney jumped in. "We propose that Ms. Walker retains ownership of the trust properties, but grants Valerie operational control over the Riverside redevelopment project. In exchange, Valerie agrees to." "No," I said, cutting clean. "That project was my father's dream. Our dream. It was meant to serve the community, not inflate her Rolodex." "You're not getting a ribbon-cutting photo while pushing out working families," I said. "That land stays in the trust. The vision stays intact. That's non-negotiable." Valerie glared, stripped of her last mask. "You'll regret this," she snapped. I leaned in. "Maybe. But I'll never regret protecting what he built." When I walked out of that office, the sky had turned overcast. The wind pulled at my jacket like it was urging me to move forward. No applause. No cinematic swell of music. Just a deep, quiet clarity that I had done the right thing, even if it came at a cost. Because standing for something, especially alone, is never cheap. But it's always worth it. Valerie didn't file the lawsuit she threatened. Her lawyers must have told her she didn't have a case. Instead, she vanished from public view, social pages wiped, club memberships paused. Connor tried one last plea via email, asking if I'd reconsider letting Mom keep a seat at the table. I didn't reply. Because there was no table anymore, only a new foundation. Mine. Callie helped organize a meeting with tenants and local leaders. I presented the plans my dad and I once dreamed up on napkins, now refined with sustainability models and equity metrics. People listened. They saw intention, not inheritance. That mattered more than victory. Franklin told me later that night, "Your dad would have been proud." I nodded. Not with tears, but with strength. Not because I'd won something, but because I had chosen not to let his legacy rot in silence. I remembered his words, "Buildings last. But what we build between people lasts longer." Valerie tried to take his empire. But what she never understood was that he left me the blueprint. Ashridge is the kind of town where the scent of cinnamon from the bakery carries 3 blocks, and where your third-grade teacher still waves at you from the produce aisle. It's also the kind of town that doesn't forget who stood by who when the storm came through. After the will reading, the ripple effect hit fast. People I hadn't spoken to in over a decade stopped me on sidewalks, hugged me in the hardware store, handed me free coffee with quiet smiles that said, "We saw what they tried to do." That kind of validation doesn't come from social media posts or legal documents. It comes from familiarity, community memory. And Ashridge remembered. Some were shocked, others were quietly smug. A few admitted they'd always suspected Valerie was more polished than principal. One woman at the post office leaned in and whispered, "Your mother would have been proud. Your father too." That caught me off guard. I hadn't heard my mother's name from a stranger's lips in years. The grief hit fresh, not from pain, but from legacy. Both of my parents were still here. Not in body. But in these moments, these buildings, these people. I realized this wasn't just about land. Or business. It was about stewardship. About walking back into a place that once broke your heart and choosing to rebuild instead of retreat. I had been gone for years, but somehow, I was still part of the fabric. And as I walked past those same sidewalks, now with a sense of ownership and purpose, I understood something my father had always tried to teach me. Property may be permanence. But roots are living things. And mine? They were waking up again. Brittany showed up on my doorstep 3 days after the storm broke. She looked tired, makeup smudged, hair pulled into a rushed bun, wearing jeans I'd never seen her in. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, before I could speak. "But I think you deserve the truth." I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the old dining table, one that had somehow survived all of Valerie's redecorating. Brittany wrapped her hands around a mug like she needed something solid to hold. She told me about Valerie's manipulation, not in vague terms, but in moments. The phone calls intercepted. The letters lost. The legal documents discussed behind closed doors. She never planned to share the company, she admitted. "You were always a threat. Not because you left. But because you were right." I didn't know what to say to that. For so long, I thought she was just another extension of Valerie's control. But now I saw the cracks, the parts of Brittany that had wanted something different all along. She pulled out a small notebook. One of my father's. "Found it in a box she was planning to throw out," she said. "It's his journal, last few months before he passed." I opened it carefully. Inside were pages of observations, project sketches, and thoughts about the town, about legacy, about me. "Emily sees the whole picture," one line read. "Not just the property. The people." I had to look away. The words carried more than memory. They carried trust. They carried him. Brittany didn't cry. Neither did I. But there was a silence between us that felt honest. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just showing up. That mattered. Sometimes rebuilding means knowing who to let back in. With the dust settling, I turned my focus to the future, not in abstract terms, but with blueprints, budgets, and deadlines. Walker Land and Community Trust wasn't just a protective shell for assets anymore. It was a living, breathing engine for change. I hired local. I listened. I brought in advisors who understood community-first design and affordable housing, not just what looked good on paper. For the first time since returning, I felt momentum without resistance. I felt the mission becoming real. We revisited every property, starting with the Ridgeview lot. That piece of land had sat unused for decades, tangled brush and forgotten potential. But now? We had plans for a mixed-use space, childcare co-op on the first floor, affordable apartments above, community garden in the back. The kind of space that told a story louder than any plaque or statue. The kind of space my father dreamed of. I kept his sketchbook in my office. Whenever decisions got heavy, I'd flip through its pages. Not for answers, but for alignment. He had done the hard work of starting. I was just continuing. But continuing didn't mean copying. It meant evolving, with integrity. Valerie had tried to sell the future. I was trying to seed it. And the community? They noticed. They responded. They came to meetings. Volunteered time. Shared ideas. Ownership breeds connection. And that's what we were building now. I no longer felt like an outsider wearing her father's suit. I felt like the architect of something lasting. The first lawsuit didn't come from Valerie. It came from someone I hadn't thought about in years, a former partner of my father's who claimed he was entitled to a portion of the Riverside property profits. It was a shallow attempt, frivolous at best, but it reminded me that power attracts challenge. I spent that week juggling calls with lawyers, zoning officials, and community leaders, all while trying to stay focused on construction deadlines. Every night I sat by the window of my rented apartment and watched the old city skyline, part legacy, part liability. Ghosts, I realized, don't knock. They show up in court filings and whispers in town council chambers. Franklin warned me this would happen. When you inherit something powerful, he said, you inherit its enemies too. It wasn't just about one lawsuit. It was about how people moved when they sensed blood in the water. Some allies stayed silent. A few switched sides. Even the town newspaper ran a passive-aggressive editorial questioning whether outsider development disguised as community revival was really any better than private expansion. The message was clear: prove yourself, again. Even after all this. Even after the truth. I didn't panic. I planned. With Brittany's help, we put together a public report detailing every property plan, every community engagement step taken so far. We hosted a town hall and let the people speak. I wasn't interested in spin. I was interested in accountability. And surprisingly, so were they. It didn't silence the critics, but it diluted them. Transparency became our strongest defense, and our best offense. My father once said, reputation is earned in crisis. I was beginning to understand what he meant. Crisis isn't just what threatens you. It's what clarifies you. Tyler didn't take his defeat quietly. After weeks of silence, he scheduled a surprise press conference outside the old courthouse, flanked by Valerie's remaining supporters and a hired PR team. The company's been stolen, he declared to the local press. My family was betrayed. I watched the live stream from the office with Brittany, who let out a sigh halfway through. It's not even a good performance, she muttered. And she was right. Tyler was fighting the wrong war, armed with drama, not facts. I could have ignored it. Let his outburst fade in the local gossip cycle. But I didn't. I issued a public statement, not aggressive, not emotional, just factual. All property and business transfers were executed under full legal compliance, with transparency and long-term community interest in mind. I attached scanned documents. Names. Dates. Signatures. The response was swift. Tyler's story unraveled. His credibility took a public hit, and even Valerie's allies began to keep their distance. But it wasn't over. Not completely. He showed up at my door a week later. No cameras. No entourage. Just Tyler, angry, hollowed out, and desperate. You think this is justice? He asked. You think taking everything will make you whole? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't feel whole. I felt responsible. And responsibility is heavier than revenge. You were handed power your whole life, I told him. And you used it to threaten. I had to fight for mine. And I'm using it to build. He left without another word. But I knew that was the last time I'd hear from him. Sometimes closure doesn't come from peace. It comes from finality. Months passed. The buildings began to rise. Families moved into new homes. The community garden at Ridgeview bloomed in late spring, rows of tomatoes, herbs, and proud kids showing off their muddy hands. Grace and I walked the paths together one afternoon, pausing by the bronze plaque installed at the edge of the playground. In memory of Richard Walker, who saw what could be and built for what should be. I traced my fingers over the engraving, silently thanking the man who had both fathered and prepared me. But legacy isn't just in monuments. It's in momentum. In the young woman who got her first internship with us and now wanted to pursue architecture because of our design studio. In the small business owner who opened a bakery beneath the co-op apartments, saying, I couldn't afford downtown until now. In Alice, my half-sister, who had returned for the ribbon cutting and decided to stay for the long term as director of the environmental grant program. We were changing lives, not dramatically, not overnight, but tangibly. Brick by brick. Life by life. Legacy, I had learned, is a living thing. It breathes through every story shared, every boundary pushed, every compromise made for the greater good. Valerie had seen it as inheritance, a possession to defend. But for me? It had become a mission to extend. I didn't want my father's name carved in marble. I wanted it whispered with gratitude in every new home's hallway. That was the measure of success now. That was the inheritance worth fighting for. And worth protecting for generations to come. The renovation of the company headquarters started small, fresh paint, better lighting, restored photographs, but its symbolic weight was enormous. What had once been a cold, impersonal space under Valerie's control was slowly returning to its roots. We reinstated my father's old office, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of where vision meets effort. We brought back the community board that featured local success stories. And in the lobby, we displayed framed newspaper clippings of the company's most meaningful projects, including the very first apartment complex he built. For me, it wasn't just an office, it was sacred ground. The place where ideas were born, strategies unfolded, and values defended. Watching the space come alive again felt like stitching together pieces of something that had been violently torn apart. Valerie had left behind more than just bad policy, she'd left a cultural vacuum. Rebuilding that part was harder than any blueprint could describe. It required earning back people's trust, not just employees, but the community, too. They'd been spectators to a family war. Now, they needed a reason to believe in peace. Each decision I made, I tried to ask, what would my father have done? Not out of reverence, but because I knew he'd built with more than cement, he built with purpose. So when the question came up about whether to convert the unused West lot into more retail or into public art space, I didn't hesitate. Art, I said. We need places that don't just serve wallets, but hearts. The team agreed, cautiously at first. But when the local high school submitted a proposal for a rotating student gallery, everything clicked. The space would become a living canvas for the town's young voices, telling their own version of Maplewood's story. That decision became a turning point internally, when even the skeptics realized we weren't just talking community impact. We were living it. Every small project completed without cutting corners, every contractor paid on time, every mother who thanked us for safe sidewalks, it all fed the culture we were rebuilding from the ashes. A year after the storm had passed, I found myself standing on the same observation deck where I'd once watched construction crews carve foundations into cold ground. Now, the view was different. The buildings stood tall and proud. The community garden below hummed with life. The breeze carried children's laughter and the smell of fresh bread from the corner cafe. And beside me stood Grace, the woman who had anchored my world when everything else was shifting. She wasn't just a confidant. She had become a part of the architecture of my life. Watching her take in the view with soft, steady eyes made me realize that all the power, all the titles, meant nothing if I didn't have someone to share them with. I'd carried the ring in my pocket for weeks, waiting for a moment that felt organic, real, grounded in who we were. And this was it. No big audience. No spotlight. Just her. Just us. I took a breath, turned to her, and pulled out the small box. You stood by me when I was nothing but a name on paper. You reminded me who I was when everyone else tried to rewrite it. I don't want to build anything without you. Her hand went to her mouth, eyes wide, not in shock, but in clarity. Emily, she whispered, voice catching. I didn't get on one knee. I didn't need to. We were already standing on everything we'd built together. She took the ring, slid it on, and wrapped her arms around me. I felt the weight of the moment settle into my bones like cement drying into permanence. There would still be storms. There would still be challenges. But we would face them together. I knew then that legacy wasn't something you leave behind. It's something you walk beside, hand in hand. The final ribbon-cutting ceremony drew the largest crowd Maplewood had seen in years. People from every neighborhood, every walk of life, showed up to celebrate not just a new building, but a new beginning. The mayor spoke. So did Alice, who had helped design the community resource hub inside the complex. But when I was invited to speak, I hesitated for a long moment. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. How do you address a town that raised you, rejected you, then welcomed you home? I stepped to the microphone and let instinct take over. A year ago, this was just a plan. Now it's a promise kept. But it's not just mine, it's yours. Because this town isn't built on concrete. It's built on character. On hard lessons, on second chances, and on the kind of faith that survives betrayal. As I looked out across the crowd, I saw faces that once glared now nodding in approval. Former critics who now volunteered on our community board. Business rivals who'd become reluctant allies. Even Valerie's name had faded from the conversations, replaced by stories of children thriving, businesses blooming, and streets feeling safe again. That was the town's quiet way of choosing sides, not through declarations, but through actions. The kind that matter. The kind that last. I ended my speech simply, this isn't the end. It's a foundation. Let's keep building, together. And as the applause rose, so did my understanding of what had truly been saved, not a company. Not just my father's dream. But a sense of belonging. Maplewood wasn't just where I grew up. It had become part of who I was. I hadn't seen Tyler in months. After the fallout, he'd disappeared from company operations and town events entirely. But one morning, I received an email with a short subject line, lunch. Attached was a restaurant name and time. Curious, I went. The place was modest, one of the newer bistros that had popped up in the revitalized downtown district. When I arrived, he was already seated, staring out the window with a half-empty coffee cup in front of him. I approached slowly, unsure of what kind of conversation this would be. Would there be accusations? Resentment? Or maybe just silence? But when he looked up, there was no venom. Just a tired sort of acceptance. "The pasta's good," he said. "I helped design the menu." It hit me then, he wasn't here to argue. He was here to share. Over lunch, we talked. Not about the past, not directly. But it was all there, layered between comments about staffing issues, wine pairings, and the struggles of running a small business. Tyler had found something he cared about, and for once, it wasn't just about money or validation. "Mom never really saw this side of me," he said between bites. "She always thought it was beneath us." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "But Dad did," I said eventually. "He would have supported this." Tyler didn't respond immediately, but I saw his jaw tighten, his eyes flicker. "Yeah," he finally said. "Maybe he would have." That moment, quiet, unspoken, but deeply human, was the closest we had come to reconciliation. No apologies. No forgiveness speech. Just two men sitting across from each other, recognizing that they were more alike than either had once thought. I didn't expect to hear from Valerie again, not after the fiery meeting at her lawyer's office and the failed settlement attempt. But life has a strange rhythm. One afternoon, Margaret entered my office with an envelope. "Courier dropped this off," she said. "No return address." Inside was a handwritten note. "Emily, you won. And you were right. I hope Maplewood appreciates what you've saved. I'm leaving the country." No need to reply. V. I sat there for a long time, rereading the lines. There was no warmth. No olive branch. But there was something else, acknowledgement. For someone like Valerie, that was as close to a reckoning as I'd get. I didn't feel vindicated. Just still. Like a door had finally, quietly, closed behind me. No slamming. Just a click. A few weeks later, I heard through an old family contact that she'd moved to Portugal. Started over. Opened a small boutique in Lisbon. Apparently, she was doing well. And to my surprise, I felt relieved. Not because she was gone. But because maybe now she would stop trying to control everything, to script every outcome. Maybe she'd finally found something that didn't require manipulation to thrive. In a strange way, I wished her peace. I no longer carried anger toward her. There wasn't space for it anymore. That part of my life had passed. I filed the note away with the other artifacts of this long journey, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, even those who oppose you the most can evolve, or at least retreat with dignity. Not everyone needs to stay in the story to have shaped it. On the first anniversary of my father's passing, we held a memorial at the riverfront. No speeches. Just music, photographs, and the unveiling of the Richard Harrison Community Pavilion. Grace had coordinated the event beautifully, local musicians played, children painted banners, and Alice read a short passage from one of Dad's old journals. "Build what outlives you," it said. I stood in the back at first, watching. Taking it all in. The smiles. The quiet moments. The generations gathering under something my father and I had dreamed of creating. Then, Grace nudged me forward. "You're not a spectator anymore," she whispered. "This is yours too." So I stepped up. I didn't need to say anything. My presence was enough. The work spoke louder than words. As the sun began to set, casting gold over the water, I felt the years of tension, grief, and redemption settle into something new, peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity. My father's legacy had survived betrayal, distance, and death. But more importantly, it had evolved. Through me. Through Alice. Through Grace. Through every person whose life would now be touched by the spaces we'd built, the values we'd upheld. I reached into my pocket and ran my fingers over the ring I now wore, my father's, refitted for my hand. A symbol of continuity. Of grounding. Of permanence, not in property, but in purpose. I turned to Grace, who looked up at me with eyes that saw everything, and I smiled. We had built something worthy. Something lasting. Something true. A year ago, I stepped off a plane with nothing but a name, a memory, and a storm of unresolved grief. I wasn't sure what I'd find when I returned to Maplewood, anger, maybe. Or regret. But I never expected to rediscover my purpose, to rebuild a future on the foundation of a past I thought was lost. Now, standing on the very ground my father and I once dreamed over, I understand something I never fully grasped back then. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in a will. It's what you build into people, into places, into principles. It's in the tough decisions you make when no one's watching. In the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you comfort. It's in the quiet sacrifices and the bold visions. And most of all, it's in the hearts you choose to trust, and the hands you choose to hold along the way. If this story moved you, if you've ever faced injustice, reclaimed what was yours, or tried to make peace with a complicated family past, then I want to hear from you. Share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you believe more people should see stories like this, stories about resilience, about values over vanity, about fighting for what matters, then then please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps the channel reach others who may need to hear stories like this right now. And if this video touched you in a deeper way, and you'd like to help keep this kind of storytelling alive, consider clicking the Super Thanks option just below the video. It's the heart icon with the $sign on it. Click it and choose any amount that feels right to you. Every contribution helps this channel stay independent and continue bringing meaningful, true stories your way. And finally, if you've made it to this point, let me leave you with one last thought. Sometimes, the most valuable inheritance isn't land or wealth. It's clarity. It's connection. It's the quiet assurance that you've done right by the ones who came before, and set something better in motion for those who come after. Thank you for watching. And remember, we don't just inherit property, we inherit the power to shape what it becomes.